Pierre. I love an analyst with the courage of a sell rating, especially when he was right. Your price target is 165. Apple's trading at around 169. When do you go to a hold? Because, I mean, a lot of the buys don't go to hold until the stock goes way down. What's your strategy here?
You know I'm not going to tell you that, right?
I can try.
You can try. Yeah, so I think when I look at a stock, I look at three things. The first one is valuation, and 165 is valuation. You take Apple, it's roughly like a $60 billion free cash flow business at $165. You're getting close to a 10% free cash flow yield. So valuation is not an issue anymore. Even if you think the iPhone business is at risk of like a secular decline over a few years, it doesn't make a case in terms of valuation for the stock to get cheaper. But that's one thing. The other thing I look at, of course, is where expectations are. And so it's interesting to see that like buy ratings are pulling back, but numbers expectations are still very high. I'm still like shy of 10% above street expectations for Apple's March quarter. So I need to have these numbers behind me to start looking back at the stock from a momentum perspective. And then the third perspective that is very important is to clarify the outlook. Remember my call was a lot of demand that pulled forward in 18, right. 19 is an air pocket. But now the key question is going to be, what does 2020 looks like? And I need to see that before answering your question.
Okay, Walter Isaacson, I feel like there's been a shift in sentiment toward big, powerful tech in general, whether you're looking at Apple, Google, certainly Facebook. A lot of these stocks always have kind of some wall of concern to deal with. I've got Apple in mind specifically. What do you see going on, and what do you think it means?
Well, I think for Apple, one of the big problems will be China. If we continue in this sort of wacky back and forth trade skirmishes with them, the court ruling in China is not good if they're going to start using things like patent for Qualcomm patents to restrict Apple's sales. I also think that you're right, and I mean, this is an important thing. There is a feeling about big tech now that the bloom has gone off the rose. This doesn't affect things right away, but when you watch Sundar Pichai not doing particularly well in front of Congress today, when you watch feelings about privacy, and then even all the things, you'll start seeing a little bit more sentiment for antitrust enforcement, for when Facebook does things like buy WhatsApp, buys Instagram, those get waved through in the past. I think people are starting to feel that the bigness becomes a vulnerability. I read a great book last night, Tim Wu's The Curse of Bigness, and it just talks about how you need a little bit more antitrust enforcement at a time when people are uncomfortable with the way these dominant companies are doing things.
Walter, just to kind of get back to something you said, you don't think Sundar Pichai is doing a particularly good job today in Congress? Anything in particular you think he should be emphasizing more?
I think he kind of waffled around the question of, are you going to do a search engine in China? He kind of said, well, we don't have plans to launch it, but clearly they're preparing it. And I think this is one of the vulnerabilities of Google, which is they are so big, there's just going to be a backlash if they start doing searches in China and giving the government or allowing the government to harvest the data of what people are searching and what they're doing online. You got to play by the rules of the country you go into, but at times, you know, Google at the very beginning of its creation was a don't do evil, don't be evil type company. I think this just puts him in a very uncomfortable position, and I thought he squirmed around that answer.
It's fascinating, the degree to which Google has run afoul of regulators in the EU. Now it's China. With Apple, it involves Qualcomm, and we'll be talking about 5G a lot more in the year ahead. I mean, these companies, I don't know, their global nature is it more reliability than other global companies?
Well, I think it makes like the picture more complicated, of course. Now, you always want to remember what disputes are about and what's the size of the argument. So if you look at Qualcomm and Apple, for instance, These guys are arguing around a $2 billion bill. So if it were between you and I, it would be a big deal. For them, it's probably much smaller. So Qualcomm would like Apple to pay more than $2 billion, and Apple probably wants to pay less. They're probably standing apart by less than $1 billion of each other. So in that game, they're trying to get the other party to the negotiation table with as much negotiating power on their own side. So this announcement yesterday in China means Qualcomm has one win, but very clearly it's not in Qualcomm's interest to see iPhones in China not being available. And this is never going to be in the interest of Apple to do business without respecting the intellectual property of another player. So these guys are going to settle down into negotiation. It's a complex process. They're fighting each other around the planet. So far, the count, I would say, in terms of legal decisions, has been more in favor of Apple than Qualcomm. So this one is a bit of a turning point, maybe. But I think we are still talking about a $1 billion issue.
And Walter, this Apple-Qualcomm thing is really about who gets credit for innovation. Apple feels like component suppliers don't deserve an outsized amount of credit, but Qualcomm's very business model is based on this idea of pouring money into R&D and then getting a big payout down the line when people need to use their technology. As we watch this setting up between these two very large companies that became successful because of the smartphone, how high are the stakes?
Well, I think this goes back to Intel being able to brand it Intel Inside, so that when you bought a laptop or a PC, you were suddenly thinking, okay, I like the microprocessor maker. And yes, it's very important to say the microprocessor is one of the sources of innovation, especially as we go into a 5G world. I think we have a larger issue with China. I agree with what you all have been saying before. This is only $1 billion or $2 billion, which I guess is small money these days for Apple. But what's really important is whether China starts using things like intellectual property decisions as a retaliation on the U.S. using intellectual property as part of a trade war. That could be very, very bad for Apple.